Imagine a child, no older than 3, sitting at a desk. While other toddlers are barely learning to speak, he is already being taught Greek. By the time he is 8, he hasn't just mastered Latin and advanced mathematics, he is perusing popular science texts and effectively running the education of his 8 younger siblings. This wasn't just a strict upbringing, it was a calculated experiment. His father, James Mill, along with the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, intended to manufacture a genius intellect, a living vessel designed purely for logic and reason, stripped of emotional distractions, capable of carrying the torch of utilitarianism perfectly into the future. On paper, the experiment was a massive success. He became an intellectual giant before he even hit puberty, but then the vessel cracked. At 20 years old, this manufactured prodigy asked himself a single, terrifying question. If all the social reforms and objectives I am fighting for were instantly realized, would it actually bring me joy? To his horror, the answer was an emphatic no. The perfect rational machine spiraled into a depression so deep he contemplated suicide. He realized that while his analytical brain had been sharpened to a razor's edge, his ability to feel, to experience beauty, art, or simple happiness had been completely atrophied. It wasn't a logical proof that saved him, but the poetry of Wordsworth. This breakdown didn't just change his life, it forced him to rewrite the very philosophy he was bred to defend, proving that a society based on pure calculation is doomed to fail. That opening story about John Stuart Mill is it's foundational, isn't it? It's not just some biographical curiosity.
No, not at all. It's the seismic event. It's the thing that drove him to redefine, well, everything. Modern liberalism, ethics, our whole understanding of freedom.
It's the absolute spectacular failure of pure, unrelenting calculation. That failure forced him to accept the absolute necessity, the emotional, the messy, even the irrational parts of being human.
Exactly.
So our mission today is a bit ambitious. We're using Mill's deepest personal crisis as the lens to look at his entire philosophical project.
And it's the right lens.
We need to unpack the rigorous intellectual lessons he learned when sheer logic failed him, and then see how his mature philosophy gives us tools to navigate today's world.
A world of conflicting narratives, information overload.
And just deep social division.
Yeah.
Mill gives us a toolkit for building a humane and rational society, precisely because he knew what it was like to be a rational machine that stopped being humane.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
His whole intellectual project wasn't about building on some flawless foundation. It was about repairing a broken one, his own mind. He realized that the tools of reason, they could give him a rudder, a direction, but they could never give him a sail. They couldn't provide the purpose or the energy. And his breakdown, and more importantly, his recovery, it generated 3 core areas of thought that we can really use as anchors for this deep dive.
Okay, let's lay them out.
First, he realized the need for radical empiricism, a relentless intellectual rigor against all forms of speculative dogma. If his own internal constructed reality failed him, he had to anchor himself in objective, testable evidence.
So get back to basics. What can we actually prove?
Precisely. Second, and this flows directly from that need for testing, was the absolute defense of open discussion. Freedom of expression, even for opinions we find abhorrent or just plain false.
Because that's the only way to test our own beliefs.
It's the only way. That open combat is the only way to safeguard what we think is true. And third, the big one, the emotional insight that saved him, integrating emotional and aesthetic cultivation.
The poetry.
The poetry, the art, the sympathy. He saw them as vital to genuine human happiness and social cohesion. Without that capacity for feeling, logic isn't just useless, it's potentially self-destructive.
Let's start right there with that terrifying origin story. This utilitarian experiment, Mill's father, James Mill and Jeremy Bentham, they really believed they could engineer the perfect moral person.
They did. They were all in on a psychological theory called associationism.
Right. Break that down for us.
It sounds complex, but the idea is kind of simple. It held that all our mental and moral feelings are just products of association, things we link together in our minds, which means
They can be manufactured.
They can be programmed. Through intense targeted education, you can associate intense pleasure with what you consider beneficial, moral action and, intense pain with hurtful action. If you start early enough and you're relentless about it, you can create a perfectly moral, perfectly rational citizen.
And this wasn't just some abstract theory. It plugged directly into Bentham's original version of utilitarianism, which was really just a numbers game, wasn't it?
It was a pure quantitative approach to ethics. For Bentham, the focus was solely on maximizing the net sum of pleasures over pains.
Just adding it all up.
Exactly. The only difference between pleasures was quantitative. How intense is it? How long does it last? How certain are you to get it? It was a rigorous, beautiful calculus on paper.
But the problem, as Mill's crisis revealed, is that this ledger book approach, it gives you no reason to say that a noble goal is actually better than a selfish one.
Precisely. There's no philosophical or emotional basis in that system to argue that, say, ending poverty is inherently superior to a lifetime of luxury and idleness, provided the idle life gives you an equal net sum of pleasure units.
So if you can't distinguish between higher and lower pleasures, then optimizing your life spreadsheet for total happiness units it's fundamentally meaningless. It gives you no hierarchy of human achievement.
It's a state where logic is completely severed from desire. And this is exactly the wall that Mill hits around age 20. He dedicated his entire being to a life of social reform based on this philosophy.
Only to realize that if he actually succeeded,
he would feel no feeling of joy or happiness. The system worked, but the operator was hollow.
He diagnosed this failure in a way that feels incredibly modern. He said his habit of analysis, this engine of pure logic, it was great for connecting causes and effects.
Perfect for that. But he argued it simultaneously tended altogether to weaken those associations which are a matter of feeling.
It's like the intellectual equivalent of debugging your own emotional operating system until you accidentally delete the core drivers.
That's a great way to put it. He called it a perpetual worm at the root of both passions and virtues. This extreme analysis just dissolves the emotional links, the crucial kind of artificial connections between a feeling like love or pleasure and a moral object like duty or the general good.
And once those are gone,
what's left? Only the purely physical and organic pleasures. And for a mind like his, he found those utterly insufficient to make life desirable.
This just resonates so strongly today. We live in an era that's obsessed with self-optimization, with biohacking, with breaking down our lives into metrics and tasks.
Absolutely.
You can get so good at the how that you inadvertently strip away the why. You remove the subjective meaning that made the tasks worthwhile in the first place.
And that's exactly where Mill found himself. He felt left stranded at the commencement of my voyage with a well-equipped ship and a rudder, but no sail.
He had the map, the logical direction, but no wind, no internal energy.
He had the intellect to pursue the greatest good, but he was devoid of the emotional fuel to start the engine.
It's a profound warning, isn't it? Intellectual rigor, when it's siloed away from emotional and aesthetic cultivation, it just leads to this deep atomization, this spiritual hollowness. He was the manufactured genius who found his engineered purpose totally empty.
And the cure, as you said at the top, it wasn't logical. It wasn't another proof. He found therapy in the poetry of Wordsworth.
Why Wordsworth?
Because it cultivated sympathetic and imaginative pleasures, which could be shared by all human beings. It reawakened the part of him that could feel with others. And this emotional discovery led to what he called his anti-self-consciousness theory of life.
Let's clarify that because it sounds like a brilliant paradox.
It is, and it became a cardinal point in his ethical creed. Mill realized that happiness is only achieved indirectly. You can't get it by making it the direct object of your pursuit.
You can't just aim for happy.
You can't. If you aim for something external to happiness, like creating art or the improvement of mankind or finding truth, you find joy en passant. You find it in passing, along the way. But the moment you stop and ask yourself whether you are happy, you cease to be so.
Happiness is a byproduct, not the goal.
It's a bonus, not a target.
That is a profound counter-narrative to our modern preoccupation with constant personal well-being. This pressure to be happy, to optimize fulfillment, Mill would say it's fundamentally self-defeating.
And it forced a philosophical change in him, not just a personal one. This insight became the basis for his most crucial revision of utilitarianism, the introduction of qualitative differences in pleasures.
So not all pleasure is created equal.
Not at all. He realized that a pleasure associated with noble character, with intellect, with self-control, what he called a higher pleasure, is intrinsically superior to a lower, purely physical one.
Okay, let me push back on that for a second. Isn't declaring intellectual pleasure higher than a simple physical pleasure? I don't know, isn't that inherently elitist? Doesn't it just reinforce the class divisions that Bentham's democratic, quantitative approach was trying to get away from?
That is the critical challenge, and Mill was very aware of this potential charge. His defense wasn't based on class or social status, but on the capacities of the organism.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he famously argued, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied.
Right.
A pig can be totally content rolling in the mud. A human, because of their higher faculties of reason and imagination, can only achieve that deep, profound satisfaction through intellectual pursuits or artistic creation or moral service. And his proof is simple. Ask anyone who is capable of experiencing both kinds of pleasure which one they'd choose.
And they'd always choose the human experience, even with its dissatisfaction.
Exactly. He said that few educated people would consent to be turned into a lower animal, even if you guaranteed them the fullest measure of those lower pleasures. That preference for the higher modes of existence, even when they bring pain, demonstrates their intrinsic superiority.
So the distinction is based on exercising uniquely human faculties, not on some arbitrary social status.
Precisely. And this realization made the cultivation of feelings not just a nice-to-have for personal well-being, but absolutely essential for his entire ethical system to even function. Because of sympathy, the capacity to feel pleasure at another's pleasure and pain at their pain. That's the emotional glue that allows utilitarian ethics to move beyond selfish individual calculations.
So if my duty to help the greatest number of people is just a logical chore on a to-do list, I'm probably going to fail at it.
Or do it resentful.
Right. But if I genuinely feel pleasure from the benefit of others, then working toward the greatest happiness for the greatest number actually becomes pleasurable for me, and therefore sustainable.
And that's the whole game. The cultivation of these feelings through art, poetry, affection, it's paramount. They associate genuine pleasure with proper moral goals, and they lift us beyond just selfish custom. Mill realized that logic is the map, but feeling is the energy that makes you actually follow it.
So Mill corrects utilitarianism by putting feeling back in, but he never abandons the pursuit of truth or rigorous intellectual defense. In fact, his crisis seems to have cemented the need for a bedrock of objective, empirical reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because his own internally constructed system failed him so spectacularly, he needed an anchor in the external world, something solid.
And for that intellectual anchor, we have to turn to his massive work, A System of Logic, Ratiocinative and Inductive, which came out in 1843. Okay, let's unpack that title conversationally. It's a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But it's not as scary as it sounds. Ratiocinative simply means the process of drawing conclusions from general principles. That's deduction.
Like a Sherlock Holmes thing, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man.
Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Interesting.
Exactly. And inductive is the science of figuring out those general principles in the first place by observing reality. Mill defined logic not as some abstract game, but as a supremely practical tool. The science of the operations of the understanding that are subservient to the estimation of evidence.
A tool for figuring out what's real and what isn't.
That's it. And at the heart of this is his radical empiricism. This sets an incredibly high bar for what we can claim to know. Mill insisted that all knowledge, even in math and logic things we usually think of as purely a priori, known before experience, is ultimately rooted in sensory experience and observation.
Wait, even 1 + 1 = 2?
Even that. This is a huge departure from rationalists who think certain truths are just inherent in our minds. Mill argued that our certainty that 1 + 1 = 2 is based on the repeated observation of objects, one thing being added to one other thing and seeing that it yields two things. The law of identity itself is built on repeated sensory experience.
So deduction, the ratiocinative part, like all bachelors are unmarried, it can't actually generate new knowledge, can it?
No, it just clarifies what's already implicit in the premise. It's a necessary tool for organizing what we know, but it's not the source of advancement.
And that source is induction.
New knowledge, the only kind that truly moves society forward, is gained only through induction. That's why he said, what induction is, cannot but be deemed the main question of the science of logic. It involves observing the world, collecting simple ideas through the senses, and then building complex ideas through association.
And this brings us right back to the failure of his education. Mill realized that false beliefs are just products of incorrectly associating two ideas.
Exactly. And the practical consequence of his logic is that we have to be rigorously, relentlessly vigilant in checking those associations. Is effect really the result of X cause? We have to test it before we adopt it as a belief.
The burden of proof is always on the claimant.
Always. And that proof has to be anchored in observable reality, not in how certain you feel inside.
This insistence on objective proof, it feels like such a powerful defense against the kind of speculative dogma that seems so prevalent today. Arguments that rely on internal feelings of righteousness rather than external evidence.
Well, this is where his framework becomes a really critical tool for analysis. We see this principle in action in this great little anecdote about a young intellectual named Arthur, who was a member of the London Debating Society and had totally absorbed Mill's empiricism.
Okay, set the scene.
The society is listening to a speaker promoting a popular new social theory, one that's heavily reliant on moral intuition. The speaker is claiming inherent virtue for certain groups based purely on a subjective, internalized feeling of righteousness. And the argument is very emotionally captivating. The crowd is eating it up.
But Arthur, our million hero, he demands rigor.
He stands up and challenges the speaker. Show me the observation. Show me the data. Show me the cause and effect. He just refuses to accept a social theory based on subjective moral certainty.
And how did that go over?
Predictably, he was immediately shouted down, called cold, morally bankrupt, detached, for not simply feeling the truth that the majority in the room claimed was self-evident.
That is a perfect million moment. His methodology completely condemns that kind of speculative reasoning.
And Mill's argument was that the study of human society, what he called the moral sciences, was so backward precisely because people refuse to apply the rigorous methods of physical science to it. We need to treat human belief and behavior as phenomena to be studied with the same burden of proof as physics.
This is so crucial because when people mistake the strength of their feeling about a belief for the certainty of the belief itself, they adopt dogmas based on faulty associations.
And if your identity becomes wrapped up in a subjective moral claim, you become almost immune to objective evidence that contradicts it. Mill's work gives us the intellectual toolkit to demand that evidence, to critically analyze claims rather than just submitting to emotional certainty. It's a defense of civilization based on the bedrock of verifiable facts.
Okay, so if Mill's logic established the method for finding truth, his great work on liberty established the rules for how we should all discuss it, this feels like the next piece of the puzzle.
It is. The challenge is clear. If feelings are essential, but can also be the source of tyranny through custom, and if truth requires this constant inductive testing, how do you structure a society that encourages both feeling and rigor? On liberty is his political answer.
It all starts with the harm principle, right?
It does. It sought to establish firm limits on the power society can legitimately exercise over individuals. And the harm principle states that the only justifiable reason to limit an individual's liberty is to prevent harm to others.
Over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign.
Completely. You can reason with people, you can persuade them, but you can't compel them or penalize them if their conduct only affects themselves. And crucially, Mill drew a very bright line here that often gets blurred today.
Yeah.
Offense is not harm.
That's a huge point. Feeling offended doesn't give society the right to intervene.
It doesn't. Now, Mill recognized the old enemy, political tyranny, violent repression by rulers, but he warned that a far more insidious danger had replaced it.
And that was social tyranny, the tyranny of prevailing opinion.
He thought this was more dangerous because it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself.
Political tyranny has laws and prisons. Social tyranny, it has norms, reputation, exclusion.
Exactly. It doesn't need to outright ban speech. It just induces people to disguise their contrary opinions, to self-censor, to ensure conformity through the fear of social reprisal.
Well, what gives this social tyranny its power? Where does it come from?
He traces it back to the coercive influence of custom. Custom leads to this pervasive, coercive feeling in each person's mind that everyone should be required to act as he would like them to act.
We mistake our own preferences, our own culturally determined feelings for some kind of universal, self-evident nature.
Yes. And this collective feeling, unchecked by reason, becomes the non-rational standard for what's acceptable. Mill said political protections aren't enough because this coercion works with a magical influence that comes from these social feelings.
Which is why the struggle for free expression is the essential battleground. It's the only defense.
And this is where he structures his powerful argument by cases. He shows that no matter what you think about an opinion, whether it's true, false, or a mix of both, we have to encourage its free and rigorous expression.
Okay, let's walk through them. Case 1. The suppressed opinion is true.
Mill says that to suppress an opinion because you're certain it's false is to assume infallibility. In theory, everyone admits they're fallible, but in practice,
We rarely act like it. We don't trust our own solitary judgment, maybe, but we place this unbounded reliance on the infallibility of the world in general, which really just means our own party, our sect, our circle, our age.
he has this brilliant observation too. He says the same causes that make you a churchman in London would have made you a Buddhist in Pekin.
Which proves that our deepest convictions are often just accidents of birth and context, not rational certainty. That should make us humble.
It should. And crucially, Mill argues that even our most warranted beliefs, like the laws of physics, have no safeguard except a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded.
This open, permanent challenge is the only way a fallible being can attain any kind of certainty. If you silence criticism, you lose your mechanism for self-correction.
Right. He makes a small exception for mathematical truths, where all the argument is truly on one side. But for every social, moral, or political question where difference of opinion is possible, truth depends on that struggle.
Okay, which brings us to the second case, which is arguably even more radical. Case 2. The received opinion is true. Why on earth do we need to bother discussing a truth we already agree on?
This is where that story about Silas the printer is so perfect.
Remind us of that one.
Silas was a deeply conservative man, a printer, a pillar of his community. He was asked to print a radical manuscript that completely dismantled his faith and his idea of government opinions he found personally abhorrent and dangerous.
And his neighbors urged him to suppress it. It's a lie. It only causes trouble.
But he printed it. And he printed it not because he agreed with a single word, but because he feared the chilling effect of silence more than he feared the danger of the lie.
That's powerful.
And Mill gives us the theory behind it. He says if a true opinion is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it becomes a dead dogma, not a living truth.
If we just accept truth as a prejudice, something we inherit without examining it, it's but one superstition the more. Mill is demanding intellectual exercise.
He is. He says to be a rational being, you have to know the grounds of your opinions and be able to defend them against common objections. This forces the mind to exercise its vital powers on the question.
Otherwise, the meaning and vitality just drain away. What's left is the shell and husk of formularies, empty phrases.
Think about it. Reciting a complex concept like the Nicene Creed becomes a meaningless formula if the believer never has to think about what those difficult concepts actually mean or why they were adopted against strong opposition in the first place. When the controversy dies, the doctrine is just received passively. It stops connecting to our inner living convictions.
That feels incredibly relevant today. There's a sense for a lot of people that our key institutions, universities, the media have stopped encouraging this friction. In an effort to protect certain truths, they've stopped allowing them to be challenged.
And Mill would call that a noble betrayal, because you are protecting a truth so fiercely that you accidentally kill it. You turn it into dead dogma.
Which is why he insisted that even if opponents of important truths don't exist,
it is indispensable to imagine them. You have to supply them with the strongest arguments a devil's advocate can conjure up. It's deliberate, necessary friction to keep truth living.
Okay, that brings us to the last case. Case 3. Both opinions share the truth.
Which Mill argues is the most common situation of all. Popular opinions are almost never the whole truth. They're often exaggerated or distorted, or they're missing some other necessary accompanying truth.
And the dissenting, heretical opinions usually represent those neglected parts of the truth, fighting to be heard.
Exactly. Truth in practical life is rarely found in one pure source. It's a matter of reconciling and combining of opposites.
Like in government, you rarely have one perfect solution. Democracy has to be reconciled with aristocracy, not of birth, but of merit and expertise. Cooperation has to be balanced with competition.
Right. And since very few individual minds are capacious enough to make that adjustment all on their own, truth emerges from the rough process of a struggle between combatants fighting under hostile banners. The minority opinion, even if it's mostly wrong, is valuable because it usually represents a neglected side of human well-being.
It's the blind man and the elephant. We each grab a piece of the truth, a leg, a trunk, a tail, based on our limited experience.
And dialogue. Even hostile dialogue is what allows us to piece together the whole animal. Silencing someone is like saying, I have the trunk, and anyone who talks about a leg is a liar and must be silenced. Mill shows that just guarantees we never see the full picture.
Before we apply this to the modern state, Mill tackles one last critical objection. What about beliefs that are considered too useful or indispensable to be questioned? Core legal rights, fundamental moral principles. Shouldn't we restrain discussion of those based on their usefulness, not their truth?
This is where Mill refuses to compromise. He won't back down from his empiricism. He counters that the usefulness of an opinion is itself a matter of opinion. It requires discussion and evidence just as much as its truth does.
So if you restrain discussion because a belief is too useful to question, you're just relying on an untested assertion of usefulness.
Precisely. And then he delivers the ultimate million mic drop. The truth of an opinion is part of its utility. You can't separate the two. A false belief cannot be truly useful in the long run. So even our most fundamental beliefs have to remain open to challenge.
So the rules of engagement are clear. Seek evidence, respect the harm principle, protect all opinions to keep truth alive. But what happens when the government, the very entity that should be most invested in truth and public information, starts breaking these rules?
This is where Mill's framework becomes a powerful tool for analyzing the governance of information, especially in our era of disinformation. Governments have three core roles regarding expression. They are a regulator, a facilitator, and a speaker.
And the Millian principle is that no matter which role it's playing, government action should never impair self-government or the collective search for truth.
That's the core test.
Let's start with role one, the regulator. This is just straight-up censorship, the most obvious violation.
It's the classic violation of on liberty. We've seen examples like the Turkish government blocking Wikipedia because it disliked certain entries, or Armenia prohibiting unauthorized information about COVID-19. It's a blunt tool that violates the argument from truth, that truth emerges from an open market, and the argument from democracy, that citizens need full information to govern themselves.
Okay, that one's clear. What about role two, the facilitator? This is about withholding information. It's subtler, a sin of omission.
But it's just as dangerous because it starves the public debate. Think of the Brazilian government removing cumulative COVID-19 case numbers from its public reports, or the U.S. government taking down climate change data from public websites.
You're preventing the public from even having the raw materials for an informed debate.
You're starving the public watchdog, the press, and the public itself of the evidence they need to question government action. It frustrates self-government just as much as active censorship does. If the government is the steward of public data and they hide it, they're acting directly against Mill's core principle of empiricism.
It's a failure to facilitate informed debate,
which has the same consequence as censorship, a poorly informed, easily manipulated public.
Then we get to the frontier of modern conflict, role three, the speaker. This is when the government intentionally injects falsehoods. Let's start with the discreditor, when officials falsely label credible sources as fake news.
This tactic is all about eroding public trust. When government actors falsely label credible journalism as fake news, the goal is to cripple the press's watchdog function. We've seen powerful officials worldwide dismissing verified reports, like the Spanish minister calling videos of police violence against Catalan protesters fabricated.
If you destroy the credibility of the messenger, the public has no external check on power left.
And that's a massive interference with freedom of expression. It creates a toxic environment that stifles participation. Mill's argument insists the state should foster a favorable environment for public debate. When an official uses their huge platform to groundlessly attack the media, they're undermining public discourse and leading directly to what we now call truth and trust decay.
The public loses the ability to tell what's a valid source and what's propaganda.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final and maybe most destructive role, the deceiver. Outright intentional lying by high-ranking officials. Well, when former Brazilian President Bolsonaro falsely claimed hydroxychloroquine was totally effective for COVID-19, or when Hungarian Prime Minister Orban lied about EU migration policies. This is so dangerous because government actors have a massive privileged platform, a captive audience, and unique asymmetric access to information.
They can tilt the whole debate. The inequality of arms is just too great.
And our ability to hold power accountable relies on the implied trust that officials won't knowingly misuse that advantage. Mill's logic suggests that when public officials lie about matters of public importance, they're acting in a way that is fundamentally incompatible with the role of communication in a democracy.
They're undermining the public's right to be properly informed.
And the state's power means that a lie from an official can cause irreversible public harm long before the marketplace of ideas has a chance to correct it. It's a direct assault on the conditions needed for rational self-government.
So we started this deep dive with John Stuart Mill's crisis. The moment he realized pure analysis without feeling just leads to despair. And we've tracked that single insight through his entire philosophy.
His mature philosophy is this profound, integrated response to that crisis of intellectual atomization. It demands rigorous empiricism, his logic to test reality. It demands absolute protection for expression on liberty to test ourselves and our opponents. And it demands a reformed ethics, his utilitarianism, that requires the cultivation of noble sentiments.
He gives us this comprehensive roadmap. Defending objective reality requires aggressive critical thinking, rejecting dogma that rests only on subjective feeling. But maintaining a thriving, humane society means protecting even the ideas we think are wrong.
To ensure we have living truth, not dead dogma.
Yeah.
And crucially, Mill argues that the energy for all of this, the energy for ethical action, the commitment to truth, it doesn't come from rational calculation alone. That energy comes from the energy of feelings. From sympathy, benevolence, affection, even indignation against injustice. And those feelings have to be cultivated through education and aesthetics.
So in the end, it's about having a complex character. That's the wellspring of democratic health and personal meaning.
Mill's life and his great works show us that intellectual progress, the kind that actually moves society forward, doesn't come from being a logical automaton. His greatest achievement came from the necessary and often painful reconciliation of rigorous logic with deeply cultivated human feeling. He demands that we embrace the ambition of being both Socrates, the ruthless cross-examiner of ideas, and the poet, the cultivator of sympathetic imagination.